Making Sense, Making Literacies is a series of 3 online CCW Dialogues events co-created with Wimbledon's 3D Lab. Workshops and exhibition spaces are both sites of making sense, of embodied and cognitive research, usually separated by different points on the production line. The pandemic has upended the historically situational sites of making and showing. Technical workshops at the heart of the Art College are creative labs where ideas evolve and coalesce through experimentation, embrace failings, and collaborative problem solving. These conversations explore the intersubjective and shared spaces of thinking, making, and showcasing through the lenses of staff from the CCW technical team. They provide a reflective space for staff to share experience of learning and teaching making practice and to showcase some of the creative workarounds they've devised over the last year, transferring essential workshop support structures into virtual holding spaces, enabling the student as maker with maker sensibilities wherever they are. Dialogues is a program of events, talks and screenings that take place online during 2021. Devised in collaboration with Camberwell, Chelsea and Wimbledon Spaces, Dialogues are hosted remotely and connected via the Chelsea Space platform, which can be found at chelseaspace.org. 3D Lab guest sessions are online technical talks or collaborative workshops hosted by the 3D Lab based at Wimbledon College of Art. We seek conversations that reflect the richness of thinking through making, technical research and development, and practical learning and teaching. We aim to provide a learning resource and develop an archive for a community keen to articulate tacit knowledge and making literacies that underpin making practice. For previous sessions, please visit wca3dlab.myblog.art.ac.uk or follow us at WCA3DLab on Instagram.
Welcome to Making Sense, Making Literacies. This is our third session in a series of 3, and it's in collaboration with Clare Mitten at the Wimbledon space, just by way of providing a space for us to critically observe where we've been, where we are, and where we're going, which seems kind of critical and incredibly valuable in this time of rapid and rampant change in our global situation, as well as in the arts education landscape and also the arts and culture landscape in general. We set up these sessions with the premise of thinking through workshops. The technical workshops and exhibition spaces are both sites of making sense, of embodied and cognitive research, and they're usually separated by different points of the production line, but actually they hold qualities that are quite similar to each other. And in particular, this session we'll be looking at hosting space and enabling practice, and you'll probably see a bit of a theme of sort of upending the concepts of what are design processes and what are making processes, and what are showing in design spaces and what are making spaces, and actually where things can be a little bit more entangled and entwined with each other. So we just wanted to give a big thanks to Clare Mitten for being a champion of the 3D Lab and the guest sessions we've been running, which have started in December, around November, December 2019 in the physical pre-pandemic, and throughout the pandemic times, throughout lockdown, we've been having these wonderful conversations with makers, designers and educators, and discussing their approach to making. And Making Sense, Making Literacies is a way of cementing a bit of our collaborative relationship with Clare and the galleries team. And long may it continue, because I think we've had such rich conversations between us. So thank you, Clare, for enabling that for us. I just wanted to give you a bit of a rundown, if you've not attended or listened or watched back to our previous sessions, just to give you a kind of really quick overview of where we're at in this series. Making Sense, Making Literacies, the first session was a panel discussion held between James Perkins of the Performance Design Technologies based here at Wimbledon, teaching theatre design, Fabienne Lee Perella, who is on the BA Product and Furniture Design course, I think based at Chelsea, although works across Chelsea and Camberwell, and Richard Barton, who she worked quite closely with in this last year. Richard Barton is now the CCW workshops coordinator, but also kind of worked on the spatial program that is between Chelsea and Camberwell. We had such a wonderful conversation just unpacking a breadth of kind of ideas about the importance of making, and the pandemic centralized the importance of making, really, which was really encouraging. It wasn't something that went by the wayside. It was something that was really kind of held center point, and in particular making as a thinking tool, as a research function or process in itself, as well as a way of engaging us in our local areas. And Fabienne shared quite just interestingly as to how she encouraged her students to engage in the technical facilities that might be in and around their cities, as she taught her course during the pandemic to students scattered across the world. So just thinking how making can help us engage with our locality. We also looked at how do we create spaces for developing or helping students to explore affinities with materials. So not necessarily teaching the ins and outs of one particular material, but how do we encourage an approach to making that helps them and enables them to be makers where they're at with whatever they have, and intrinsically to kind of ignite or fuel a curiosity that will kind of be the fuel for their making practice as we go. We also looked at how the pandemic forced creative partnerships to be forged across courses, programs, and disciplines, and broke down silos which have long been established in almost an instant in order to problem solve, to come up with innovative solutions in supporting our students in this time. And long may that reign, in the sense of where are we making the most of being in an institution, a leading world recognized institution with such wonderful resources across disciplines and courses. Session 2 took us to speaking to Will Waterhouse and Tyson Howard, two technicians who are now based at Wimbledon. But in this session, we were talking to Will Waterhouse in his role as an animatronics technician based at Wimbledon, and also to Tyson Howard in his role based at Camberwell, part of the sculpture and photography program there. We looked at the kind of difficulties in teaching making practices online, this kind of embodied practice that we know and love. How do we suddenly translate that into these disembodied environments, these kind of impersonal, almost kind of dehumanizing in some senses, of speaking into the void of these blank screens and struggling to connect with the people we were talking to. We also discovered in particular some discoveries along the way, and part of this process of making sense, making literacies is really to articulate our practice as technicians running these technical resources and workshops across CCW, and some of the amazing practices that we just do but don't necessarily articulate, and similarly in transferring tacit knowledge. How do we do that? What we do it so naturally without kind of talking at some point, because you're in the same spaces that you're sharing with the people you're teaching. So how does that happen when we are suddenly thrust into a disembodied space online? We also looked at how we can really harness, now that we've been fully physical pre-pandemic to fully online during the pandemic, to this now in between phase where we've been kind of working out what does a blended space look like, part physical, part online, and really what are the benefits of those that we can kind of harness going forward. That brings us to session 3, which is really a suggestion or a hypothesis as to how we can do that. So we've got a suggestion of a bit of a practice or a philosophy that has been emergent at Wimbledon, I would say for some time, actually, even before pandemic. We're looking at hosting space by way of enabling practice. So enabling practice by looking at how, as technicians, we can host and support space for students to discover and own their own practice. And in particular, we're kind of discussing the shift that sometimes we feel from being problem solver or provider or expert of knowledge, in which we kind of distill students with, to more of a enabler or host in order to provide scaffolding for new activities or knowledge to emerge, but with having the student own that process, so that they are encouraged and enabled and feel confident in being makers where they're at. So it's with great pleasure that we can spend a bit of time speaking to Jo Howcroft, who's our lead specialist technician in production at Wimbledon. We've got Nigel Little, who is our specialist technician in sound, lighting and production, and lead in the digital performance lab. Jack Perry, our specialist technician in digital video, who runs the film and video department at Wimbledon. And I'll be hosting. I'm Ash. I run the 3D lab at Wimbledon. And as mentioned, Clare Mitten will be moderating for us. Just by way of starting, I wanted to kick off with a bit of an introduction into our technical skill session we ran literally just before the pandemic started, probably the week just before we were told to go into full lockdown. And it was almost kicked off and encouraged by this notion of holding space. And I had the privilege of talking to some students at Chelsea on the kind of MA Curating and Collections course this week, or last week rather, in kind of looking at what is this kind of hosting space? How do we encourage enabling practice? And what do we need for that? What is the floating space where we can kind of help people float until they find meaning, especially in this time of incredible complexity? So I just wanted to put this quote up here from Nick Udor, who's the co-founder of a creative consultancy called Nowhere, who engages in sort of change management, but also just looking at what does creativity mean and how do we harness it. And he's got this quote that just says, "The challenge within the context of shaping and making new futures is to create spaces that feel held, purposeful, charged with energy, and where people are called forth to do things they never thought they could do. These spaces allow for possibilities to arise and latent potential to be released." Now, this is what I'm particularly interested in. These containers, spaces, and working practices need to be strong enough to hold the uncertainty and emotion that emerges when we disrupt the status quo. They need to be safe enough to speak the truth, and they must create the openness and trust needed to step into the unknown. They need to be subtle and still enough to catch glimpses of the new, which I think is an amazing mandate and actually speaks to a little bit of our practice emerging from Wimbledon. As I said, there was a workshop that we ran in collaboration with Sophie Jump, who is the second year second year leader or senior lecturer of the BA Theatre Design based at Wimbledon. And this technical skill session we proposed was situated within Unit 8. And Unit 8 is a way of, it's a sort of based within a text. Last year it was The Tempest. This year it was Macbeth. And we looked at the learning outcomes, and there was a lot around teamwork. How do we engage with the text? How do we fully realize from sort of design through to concept through to realization? How do we realize our ideas? And so we began to kind of challenge this idea of what is a workshop space? Is it always the end point, or could it become the starting point, which we know it often is? So this was our kind of mandate to kind of run a session called Make.Light.Play, with this idea of playful approach to making and lighting. And I ran this with Jo Howcroft, which I'll hand over to in a minute to kind of share her response in working with these sessions. So as you can see on this slide, it was just kind of a way of we ran it as a bit of an escape room, really. So it was a 6-hour session with an hour's break in between, where we encourage students to map out a space collectively decide what space they were using, how are they going to designate space for set, for action, for view, for the audience, and all the practicalities that ensued. And then we worked throughout the day to the point where we were kind of lighting their set, dressing and lighting their set, towards the end where we were almost ready for a performance to take place, and then they were allowed to be released from the room. Now you can see that that's quite a physical workshop, working together. Pandemic hits, and Sophie's asked us to kind of translate this phenomenal kind of time together, this holding space that we created for students physically, to an online space. So we decided to bring Nigel in. So Nigel is going to share a little bit about how he contributed to this workshop. And it was based on, we called it Sound.Make.Light.Play, because we really wanted sound to feature by way of creating a character and starting with sound and kind of working backwards. One of the principles of these workshops were to start with the material and see what kind of grows from it, really. See how design can maybe be thought of through thinking through materiality and making first. So designing through making. Joe suggested that we take this article as a way of kind of a point of reference, which is the Xavier Mastre's Voyage Around My Room. And it was a 1790 text about how to observe or experience your room in kind of new detail, a fresh way of looking at it, which just seemed this wonderful kind of link to kind of this historical piece of writing that really spoke into being in lockdown and helping these students kind of relive or think through the spaces that they found themselves in. Palettes soon became central, localized places where we collaborated with students, set up structures for these sessions. So you'll see this is kind of a basic kind of Padlet layout, which would be as a collaborative tool that students can kind of add to as they go. In particular, these sessions, we always started them by way of rules. So Joe, Nigel, and I provided some rules that we needed them to abide by to kind of keep them safe, as well as to keep the essence of the workshop going. So some key ones was to be safe, to kind of consider their environment and watch out for trip hazards and that sort of thing. Give yourself space to work, but also to choose one space and to treat the screen as a proscenium. But also to play, like that was like a very definite rule to kind of express that we really wanted to be a playful session. So just wanted to kind of show you one student's journey through the day. So there was a section of mapping out the space and understanding where they were working, kind of playing with the screen and what view we were seeing in, and then thinking through structure and set elements and what was going to hang the scene that they were interested in. And then exploring texture in dressing the space and set, and then sealing the scene with lighting, which Nigel will share on. So I just wanted to show you two very quick clips so you can see some of the sound, because the sound became incredibly important in these sessions. So I'll quickly show those and then I'll hand over to Joe. So this is Rafi's piece, who I just showed you now.
Evil spirits.
Okay, so that was Rafi's piece, and then I just wanted to show you George's as well. think I'll leave that there just by way of just giving you a quick introduction into that project. I'll now hand over to Joe. Joe, could you come and share with us your perspective on being involved in that project?
Thank you, Ash. That was an amazing introduction to what we did. Here I am desperately trying to search my files that I uploaded. Okay, so yes, hopefully you can all see that. Bit of context. These are angles from, this is a different angle from the from what Ash showed. So yeah, so as Ash was saying, students were given a set of parameters. We had rules, we had available materials. They were limited, but we didn't make them use anything. They could have used nothing at all. They could have used everything. We gave them certain timings. We gave them loose context. So they investigated material properties in order to design and construct a static production. So the students were designing their set while making their sets. So it was all about dynamically responding to plans in their heads. This is exactly what we're talking about, thinking through making and while making. So while they were making, they were also devising a storyline for their production. In the second half of the day, I gave them a brief lesson in lighting design, and then I let them loose on the equipment. And while they were investigating what the lighting actually did in real life, they then started forming a lighting design that was working alongside the set that they had designed in the first half of the day. And so lighting design can make or break a production. So in this context, it allows students to sort of see a fully formed thing rather than objects laid out in a room. You know, it feels quite blank. When you put lighting on top of it, it's a whole new dimension, and they see it as a fully formed product. And so within that, students quickly formed working relationships, and they dealt with communication and sometimes communication problems. There was lots of problem solving going on, and teamwork was definitely at the centre of it. So what Ash and I wanted to do was we wanted to see production work happening in like an untypical performance space. And so that meant we had our own interesting set of parameters to work with. Little did we know that would be really useful in a pandemic. So led on to the Sound.Make.Light.Play. And Ash was saying, we used the journey around my room text. It was such a bizarre find at the same time as kind of thinking about doing this project. It was wonderful. So Ash, Nigel and I worked, we guided students to create individual performance pieces in their own homes, using the camera, I'm going to do this, as a boundary or a proscenium arch. And they used Macbeth, which is their unit work, as context. So we wanted them to find objects in their houses as like a guided discovery of their own practice in their own homes. We wanted them to find objects that emitted light or was interesting to, like, were just interesting. They might have made an interesting sound, or it felt unusual, or objects that gathered that they found might not obviously go together, but still things had a legitimate place at the table. So within this project, we would give them guidance to create this production. So it would be a lit set with a sound piece, as you saw the examples. So why we chose sound? Well, sound is adding a layer of sound design. It enabled sound to be used to form the character or give context to their piece. In preparation, I asked students to pick several objects prior to the workshop happening, and they needed to spend a bit of time investigating material properties in terms of auditory and emotional responses. The responses would be noted on like a spreadsheet, and they would use to form layers that linked sound and emotion. The editing process, once all the sounds are recorded, was guided by prompting students to inquire how they heard the sounds in their space, and how might it play a part in like character formation. So this is way more than just gathering a few sound effects. It's all about gathering, it's all about building a character and building a world. From character formation, students then had context to work with. So, so what they did with that is they built a physical world with as a set with Ash's guidance for the character to live in, and then finally it was lit to bring out the emotional impact through lighting, which was guided by Nigel. And throughout all this, students were guided lots of prompt questions, lots and lots of support throughout the tasks, but they had complete agency in how they formed their responses to it. There was complete variation in the responses, which was really pleasing to see, actually. And it created lots of different avenues for conversation and exploration. And what was nice is students felt they felt really out of depth with sound at the start of the session. By the end of it, they had basically composed these fantastic pieces, which I don't think they even knew they could do. So my intention was to make the concept of sound design as accessible as possible, and to guide students through creative blocks and into a presentable product, which we did get. Working from an online situation this year is rather perversely enabled sound design teaching, more sound design teaching than if we were doing face-to-face. And as Ash was showing, Padlet has been, oh sorry, those are the tasks I did. Padlet has been a wonderful medium in which to display products and research, and it's a great digital artifact for both students and tutors. And I'm just going to quickly go through one thing that I've been doing this year, which I think is really useful thing to talk about. So these are theatre practice sessions which I've been running this year. And these came out of a desire to make theatre in an online environment that aimed to mimic a studio atmosphere, because I didn't have a theatre to play in. So I had to think of a method to translate real world situations that I encounter as a production manager, and all these problems that I have to deal with, into something students could tackle at home. And the key thing to do was to use like sustainable materials like recycling in all of these things. So I ran weekly sessions, which created a space for conversation, making, problem solving, and for exploring technical arts such as performance lighting and sound. And the format was the same each week. So I would describe a topic, I would show some reference images, and I would set the task with defined timings, allowing time for students to present their work and receive feedback from all participants, including me. So some of my favourite tasks included recreating favourite artworks in a performative way. I did communication in drawing other than using a dominant hand, transforming an object's structure using light. We created adverts with a strap line for their unit work. You can probably see some of that here. We created an exoskeleton. That was a real focus on disability and inclusion. And also we created the sense of time passing. I encourage students to keep mics and cameras on and to keep the chatter going. I really wanted this safe and inviting community space. I asked students to plan their response to the task, but there was no pressure to create their best work. This was all about the methods they would employ in an approach to a task and problem solving. So students ended up creating some astonishing pieces that have gone on to inform future creative decisions, which I'm really pleased about. The sessions were great for increasing presenting skills as all students engaged in giving feedback to each other. And they were adding to their digital portfolios as well if they wanted to. And some of these were recorded via videos or photos, and some were just presented live. So the work felt really dynamic and transient. So ultimately, these sessions were about a guided way in thinking through making while making. There was lots of prototypes going on, allowing students to embrace and celebrate their exploration. And you could track the increasing complexity in their lighting, for example, as the sessions went on. So for me as a tutor, it was a really useful way of learning about the individual styles of the student, and how the individual needs can be supported going on. Thanks, Ash, that's from me.
Amazing, thanks, Jo. And I think it's really worth noting that the students renamed those sessions. Therapy was theatre therapy. Hey Joe, was that the term?
Yeah, they coined that fairly early on, which I was delighted by.
Yeah, and it just speaks to creating these spaces that students can own and have agency. And I really love that sentiment of keeping mics on to hear the sounds of industry going on, and this idea of thinking through making whilst making collectively and together, which I think those sessions really embodied. Thanks, Joe. I think we'll just hand over to Nigel to kind of share a little bit about the lighting element, kind of experiencing that workshop online for the first time whilst leading it. And also just maybe following on to what Joe just slightly touched on there in terms of thinking about accessibility. So I'll just hand over to Nigel.
So basically, when Ashleigh and Joe approached me about this session, the thing that I immediately worried about was that most of the subjects that I teach involve lots of expensive and complex equipment. So like the lighting desks that we use, and all of like the lights that we use in the productions, and it was trying to get the students to recreate what we can do with these tools, basically. So the key for me was to design activities that would ignite inquiry, encourage them to think differently, and so see if I could get the students to really think about the physical with regards to lighting design, and then think creatively how they could recreate these sort of effects from this sort of equipment. And try and emulate it to the best of their abilities with the tools they have to hand. So simple desk lights or torches and stuff like that. So to recreate colour, for example, I tried to build a scaffolding and how they could do that. So I would suggest making coloured liquids that they could put in front of the light to change the colours, to create their own sort of stencils of different shapes, which we call gobos in the theatre world. How they could recreate that effect and use that within their lighting design, and just to like give them the skills that they would need to try and adapt and aid them to achieve these sort of results without this expensive equipment. And those sort of examples of lighting design, which would include the texture, the color, the intensity and focus. And obviously with this equipment, you can achieve some real great effects and generate different mood and feeling with your sets, but they didn't have access to any of this equipment, obviously. So it was just about rethinking how I could get the students to recreate that, basically. And the best way to do that was just to simplify everything. So I just got them to think about where the light source would be, how they could recreate the color, etc., etc. And one of the things that we did with this session was we sort of generated a precursor for them to, let me just stop sharing now. The basic thing that we did was we gave them sort of things to think about before that session. So I tried to get them to think about light, how it worked, how the physics of light worked. So within the space, how does it reflect off of surfaces? Is the light hard? Is it soft? Does it like, where are the shadows? Are the shadows hard? Is the light high? So position of light. And it was just getting them to think about the actual physical of what we achieve in the theatre, but scaled down to a very, very basic form. And the results that we got from that were quite amazing, really. It blew us all away with what they were able to achieve with so little. And the other benefit of this that I noticed is when we eventually got back on site, they were so geared up and ready to go with when they did have access to this equipment. It was like the blended version was a precursor sort of delivery primer for when they when they was eventually got onto site and was able to do it in physical form with all the equipment. So it really sort of set them up for that, because they were thinking about it in the way that the physics of this equipment works, basically. And it was just really positive sessions with really positive results. The precursors I gave to them with regards to light was to observe the world around them, and how light behaves in their environment. I asked them to think about shadows again, as I said, and how light is absorbed or reflected. I got them to thought about time and location, natural light, artificial light. I asked them to watch TV and make observations and think about what they was watching in scenes and how the different lighting affects their emotions and their perspective. And I also asked them to research light sources to understand the difference between the different types of light that we use within theatre, and then just got them to gather as much equipment as they could ready for the session. And a lot of the time in the blended model, we end up just talking to the students quite a lot. And I think a lot of the time when you use that method, you run the risk of losing engagement. So the key really that we all decided to this was we had to get the students to play. And sometimes it's a bit nerve-wracking when you ask the students to go and do these tasks, and you're just sat there waiting for them to come back to you with what they've done. But the results were brilliant, and we was all pretty blown away with what they achieved, really, with so little. I think that's about it from my side of things, really.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I think you're right, and we were incredibly like blown away, especially, and you know, you could kind of see the quality of just even those two small clips that we showed earlier, of the intensity of that sound, and the sound really providing a context to the text of Macbeth, and just that whole framework really coming together through their exploration. But what I loved about what you said, Nigel, is about igniting inquiry. And I think that's really kind of one of the key things of this idea of hosting space and enabling practice, is this idea of where are we providing scaffolding or provoke, kind of prompting to kind of ignite the inquiry in order to then feel that they're making practice. And it's just wonderful to see how you've actually seen the results of coming back into the space, and what's that done to their kind of appetite to kind of get on board with the kit that they do have available to. And that kind of brings me to welcome Jack, who has been working on something a little bit different to what you've just heard, is these film and theory sessions, and partly because it really links to that nature of igniting inquiry and almost helping students to own their own inquiry. And but I'm going to hand over to Jack, because he'll articulate it much better than I. So Jack Perry.
Yeah, so it's interesting that kind of like where this came from. I mean, Nigel actually just mentioned something I think was really pertinent. What I might try and do, I might just share, maybe I'll share like the image that I'll come back to. Sorry, let me just share that there. So realistically, Nigel just mentioned something that I think twigged like quite nicely in my head, where he said that at one stage he was kind of like prompting students to go away and I guess just watch TV and think actively about what those like moments in TV where things are lit in a certain way, what kind of emotional responses that provokes. And what's really interesting about that is that I guess where the whole idea of these film theory sessions really began was about creating essentially almost like a safe crit space, but to criticize narrative filmmaking. And to look at films made by kind of key film practitioners and look back through film history, and to start creating a space within which students could engage over this. I suppose in the kind of first instance, you could sort of boil it down almost like a film book club. But what I decided was really that there was I suppose like room in the middle of the curriculum, or the curricula, different areas of different curriculums across the site, where film theory and the way in which films are made kind of sat in a bit of a gap, where bits of this were being picked up perhaps in contextual studies and things like that, but there wasn't a kind of safe space where people could discuss this stuff themselves. So really this began as a very small scale intervention. I grabbed like 8 students, 2 of which each were from different courses from across the whole site. And I wanted to kind of make sure that we began with a collaborative approach, where we had students from fine art, had students from theatre and screen, but also had acting students available in the space to kind of like start interrogating these films together. So I began with 8 students, of which I was quite happy for these sessions to grow, but kind of really wanted them to grow organically. So the idea was really that things would just develop through word of mouth. And I suppose just to give a quick kind of like from the start to the end, the arc was such that by, I guess, the kind of the best attended session we had was maybe upwards of like 44 students at one stage, which I believe was probably like literally the session before the first lockdown and before COVID began. So we built up a huge amount of momentum over the first term of the academic year in 2019 into the second term, and then obviously that was kind of like paused by COVID, which I'll come back to. But just for context, the way the sessions look is we have students physically present in the room, and we would essentially show clips from each of between 2 and 4 films. And those clips would be anywhere from like 4 minutes long to 10 minutes long. And then what we would do is we'd show that clip, and then I would just ask the students what they thought about it. And then the room would kind of turn into, as Ash has mentioned, scaffolding quite a few times here. And I think that word is just so perfect for the way in which we try to set these sessions up. I really wanted to just act as a facilitator rather than a teacher. So I wanted to sit kind of, yes, at the front of the room, but really almost in the middle of the room, and to allow people to like bounce off each other via myself, and to start to essentially generate their own content, almost generating their own curriculum. I think the other thing that relates to the fact that students were able to create their own curriculum up to a point is that all of the films that we looked at, maybe with the exception, I guess, of the first session where I kind of had to work it out for myself, all of the sessions after that were always based on films that were recommended by students that were attending the sessions. So in effect, I would help curate session to session, but realistically, the sessions were ultimately curated by the students themselves. And as such, they were kind of really building their own curriculum. So if, for example, on a Tuesday, I would receive an email that evening after we'd had a session, oh, I really enjoyed the film we looked at today, maybe next week we can look at a film by David Lynch. That meant that the next week I had something to bounce off, and then could curate films maybe taken from 2 people that had emailed me a couple of weeks before about things that maybe were around a similar topic to David Lynch, or had some kind of theme that we could pull together. And at that stage, you're then able to kind of host a session where students are able to discuss things with each other and to learn, and also to really kind of come up with their own critical analysis, and for students to feed off that. That was really coming from their own curriculum, basically. So that was very much the start of the process. And of course, this was all, as I say, originally in person, and got to a point where we were able to just have kind of not socially distanced, like 44 people in the space. And then, of course, COVID happened, and we were at a situation there where not only had I been super excited about how well the sessions had gone, but also about the attendance and about the feedback I'd been getting from the students in person. And to be totally honest, also my own enjoyment, how much I enjoyed spending time between 5:30 and 7:30, sometimes 8 o'clock every Tuesday evening, as an extracurricular session that existed outside of their formal teaching, but could be something that we could all engage with. I enjoyed it so much that I really wanted to carry these sessions on as well. And lockdown being the way it was, I guess all of us were looking for things to do, right? So at that point, I was very keen to keep running the sessions in some form. And as we were all kind of over that Easter break, trying to cobble together, like, what would we do and how would we present that stuff? Really where I began, and I'll click on this image just here. I'll share this picture. So the way I began was, I thought, right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically produce a piece of almost like YouTube style, like, or YouTuber style, like critical analysis of some of the films that have been recommended. So I'll still be delivering critical analysis, but it will be in a space where people can then comment in the chat function or something like that after. But what I was doing was pre-making videos and then delivering them to the students. So I did this once for the first session, and just the situation being how it was, I was like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to produce a survey after that, and I'll hear what the students have to say about how much they enjoyed the video and whether or not the video is working for them as a replacement for our in-person film theory sessions. And so what I've just shared with you here is kind of like the first set of responses that I got, of which what we can see here, so I've got the title at the top, do you think this format will work for future film theory sessions while we are still learning online? And I had like a fairly positive response. The strongly agree and the agree like gave a good impression that people had enjoyed the videos. But I could tell already that like, you know, the students and the relationship I had with them by that stage was such that for people to go with agree was almost more negative. For everyone to not be in the strongly agree, I kind of knew there was something up. And then as we came down to the comments, I had like, I've just shared one response with you here, but we had some really, really good responses that kind of were all in the same area. So the students were saying things like, I really enjoyed the session. I'm so glad we're able to have this session because honestly, the film club is one of the best things from uni. But I think the format may be a bit too static and lose a little bit of the club vibe. I know it can be quite hard to settle up something live because of all the different time zones, but if we could manage to do the sessions in a more interactive platform, that would be amazing. Of course, blah, 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 if there's, you know, if it's too complicated, we don't have to. But essentially, I took this as a response. The whole ethos of the sessions is the students are building these kind of like this environment themselves, and I'm just facilitating it. So at that stage, it was my job to think really of how we would then mediate these in an online environment. So that leads me on to the environment we then used for, I guess, pretty much from March 2020 through till, realistically, it was probably March 2021. So really for a full year, probably about 30 sessions, I would say, where we had this kind of blended, this kind of fully online environment. So it was mediated by me still, but as you can see, it was from my bedroom, the students were in their bedrooms, and I was basically still sharing the clips and sharing the sound and allowing the students to engage with the clips in the same way we did before. So this worked, I guess, as a kind of response to COVID and became a safe space for the students to come that was kind of as interactive as we could be while being in the online forum. The ethos was still the same. We still discussed very similar topics, and we still looked at films that were all curated by the students themselves. And in truth, I think the sessions went really well and were still very well attended. We would regularly have kind of like 18, 20 students. And as I say, that ran all the way through until we were basically back on site. And as soon as we came back on site, it was then, I guess, my job again to work with the students to think of a properly blended environment. How could we get back to having some of that live experience, the thing that people miss the most, is being able to sit in the room together, hear each other talk, and to experience things on the big screen with sound, and to actually be able to interact with each other in the space and to investigate things in person, while also having some of the most dedicated students that came to every single online session based in Florence in Italy, or 2 students that were based in China that were coming every single week despite the time difference. So what we did onwards was we moved into the blended environment, which brings me back to the first slide, which is effectively how we ran the sessions up until the end of term. And indeed, the last session of the year was last Tuesday. And the format essentially looked like this, where all I have is I have myself at the front. I am sharing my screen, and I have the content ready to go. So I have clips from 3 of those films. But what I'm also doing is I'm running a separate kind of hub, which is broadcasting that onto Teams and makes it available for students in different countries. I then have a screen inside the room, which has the chat function, but also the images of those people that are online. So people can actually effectively enter the room, either via the chat function or literally to like have their picture come up and to speak through the speakers, and they can interact with people in the room. And then I've got a microphone there as well, which is facing the audience, which means that if people in the room would like to talk to those people online, they could do it that way as well. And realistically, these sessions were, again, really well attended, not only in person, but also had at least 5 or 6 students attending every week online. And I think really kind of in terms of that idea of scaffolding and in terms of that idea of being responsive, which are 2 of the kind of keywords that have come up for me today, I think this hopefully is kind of like a good example of that. And I think, I guess this is part of the reason that Ash very kindly invited me to be involved today, is because I'd like to think that we have here a blueprint for something that if, you know, COVID continues in the way it is, or indeed we find ourselves in an environment in September where we still need to be working in a blended mode, that we are still delivering things in a way that makes sure we are still delivering inclusively and including students that aren't able to be on site but are still ultimately enrolled on a course to engage kind of as much as they physically can with students in the space, while not kind of like having to, I guess, dilute the experience for those students who are able to attend and are able to share a kind of live and personable environment together. So yeah, I hope this is like a really good example of something that we've been doing that I guess could be really nice. I don't know, kind of best practice for other ways of delivering for other people. And I'm really keen to kind of like get the word out that this is something that I think has been really successful and we've enjoyed doing, because I think this could be a really good method for other people in the future. Sorry, I know I've talked a little bit too long there, Ash, but I tried to rattle through it as quick as I could.
No, absolutely not. It's good to hear from you and hear your process, and also to say some of this was born out of your PG cert as well in learning and teaching in higher education, which actually a lot of our texts have got that qualification in their back pocket. What I loved about what you're saying is, you know, just when you were talking about, yes, I'm in the front of the room, but I'm actually in the middle of the room, being a facilitator. And I wondered if we could just talk about what it's unpacking the sometimes intangibility of what that is. And I think that's where I was trying to get to with this session. Is my language is this idea of a host, really. Picking up on what Joe was saying in terms of how do we mimic the studio atmosphere and have this kind of create those spaces and those atmospheres that sort of help or encourage this agency. And then with Nigel thinking about how do we ignite inquiry through kind of guidance and guided kind of meditation, as it were, on process and materiality, but also this idea of simplifying. Like, I think that was such a key lesson for us, that actually we could translate our practice online, but actually we needed to transform our practice online and in the blended space. So I wondered if we could just open up to a bit of conversation, and one of the threads thinking about the facilitator, but also what's kind of been brewing, I think, behind this is this idea of curating authentic connection in safe, trusting spaces, which kind of takes me back to that initial quote I shared, like these kind of innovative spaces that need to be safe in order for people to feel that they can own and have agency. And that's something that Will Waterhouse picked up on last week, was he really quickly discovered that students needed community, and so he took it upon himself to organize sessions, but really to then step back and allow students to communicate through breakout rooms online together. So I just wanted to throw it out and maybe have a couple of minutes of just what, you know, a bit of a collective sigh. We're here, a bit of relief of like, you know, managing to get through this year and actually doing some phenomenal work. And like you say, Jack, providing some blueprints for us to go forward, really. But I wondered, like, maybe if we could just spend a bit of time thinking about what is our role as makers, as practitioners, as facilitators. What does that look like? What is can we put some more language to, yeah, what does it mean to kind of make these spaces or put the scaffolding up, or, yeah, I don't know. I'm going to throw it out there and see if you guys.
I mean, the first thing that I think is really important is, unfortunately, kind of, I guess, the hardest bit, because it can only take time, is building community and building trust. And this is something that's still, you know, the kind of, I guess, the standard like formula of delivering lectures, for example, is actually often predicated on the idea that students maybe only attend, I don't know, a lecture every week or something like that, but there's such a big group that it's quite difficult to form community. And because there isn't room to discuss things with each other necessarily, but maybe you can do a bit of Q&A, there isn't as much opportunity to interact. Now, as I say, the thing is that it takes time. But by the time you've had, let's say, 8 weeks where every single week the same students are there, and they have probably 75% of an opportunity to talk, while the facilitator or the host, the lecturer, quote unquote, maybe has 25% of the time to talk. suddenly your community starts to build, and there starts to be, even if it's vicarious or like unknown, the students begin to build confidence in how they interact with each other, but also how they present their ideas. And that starts to snowball from student to student and turns into a community atmosphere where, what was really interesting, Ash, when you said about simplifying it just then, the first thing that came to my head, which is kind of, I guess, one of the last things I want to say about it, is that you can get to a point where the community is such and the confidence is enough that you can say, show a clip, and you can finish the clip and say, right, who wants to go first? And you say nothing for 25 minutes. And that is kind of, for me, was the ambition, and like fortunately has been kind of where we've got to with it. And that's kind of big credit to students forming that kind of confidence and that bravery in what is ultimately still a short amount of time, 8 weeks, you know, like, but they build that by kind of like sharing those experiences together. I think that's kind of all I wanted to say on that.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Jack. Totally. It's getting the students to engage basically in a blended model, which is the most difficult part. And when they're engaged, they're going to be connected, and they're going to focus and work, and they're going to achieve things rather than just sitting there watching a screen, listening to someone lecture on. Really, I mean, on that sort of model, I've seen students stand up who forgot their cameras are on. I've seen them stand up and go to the window and have a cigarette and stuff. So I think it's key. You've hit the nail on the head there. It's getting them to engage in this model.
Yeah, and I think, thinking about the listening space in terms of thinking about our role, and that's even when you said that, like the challenge of not saying anything for 25 minutes. That is, that is a skill in itself, to actually let things emerge as they come, and kind of to be uncomfortable in that space. But actually, there's something in that you're creating, right? You're creating the parameters of, I'm here, but I'm listening, and also just to commend you for putting that survey out, to be like, okay, well, actually, I'm going to put this content out there, but I'm actually going to listen out for whether that's effective. I think we don't often have that time to allow these feedback circles to come back and to listen to the feedback. So, but I like that idea of listening being an active component of creating enabling space, like hosting space to enable practice. Joe, I wonder if you could, like, because you must have come across a bit of that, just for the very nature for your students to be calling your theatre practice session theatre therapy, there must be some sense that they felt seen, heard, acknowledged in some way.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of my main aims during this pandemic, because I knew this pandemic was going to be a rough ride, was that we all just needed to be a community, and it didn't matter what we did as long as we were doing it together. There's a thing called morphic resonance, which those of us who don't know PG set know all about. It's where we all feel like this kind of unspoken sense of like everyone's doing the same thing at the same time, and it feels wonderful. So everyone's like getting involved in that. And as much as we were doing the making, alongside the making, because we cut our mics open, is we could just chat about anything we wanted to chat about, and we were going to some deep topics. We were talking about, like, nothing was like off limits, and so it was a really positive space where students could come and just let off some steam. Because I'm not an academic, they felt like it wasn't going to be judged at the end of the unit. So they came and they talked and they contributed, and they kept their mics open and they kept their videos on. And my PG set tutor couldn't believe it when he observed it. He's like, how did you do it? I'm like, well, I think they just trust me, and I trust them, and I listen to them and they listen to me. And what I've always talked about is this extended family we have at Wimbledon. Like, yeah, we're a campus, but we're like this crazy little family that we live in each other's pockets, and we would do anything for each other, and that includes the students. And we have always got eyes on everybody all of the time, and I think that translated itself onto online as well. So we didn't really have a base, but we still had that sense of being at Wimbledon. And from the work that we did, we got so much better like emotional responses. I'm thinking theatre design unit 5 was basically put their heart on their sleeve and make a story about them, and you wouldn't believe what they came up with because they trusted us, and that was so important. So it's yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but that's how I say that.
Well, no, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Like, and just talking about that morphic resonance, I think that's really fascinating to actually go, well, and it goes back to this idea of community, and that actually we don't necessarily give its credence actually for a pedagogical tool. And also, you know, as technicians running technical resources that are open to students across course at any time, we have developed this mentality and philosophy of providing these safe spaces for exploration, but we've not necessarily articulated how we do that. And that was the hope for these making sense, making literacies, really. And partly even going back to making literacies, that was a term coined by the 3D Lab in order to really articulate these wonderful, like, integral processes of, or ways or approaches of teaching, making in the contexts that we do. I just wanted to, I'm aware of time, but I'm also, I'd love to bring Clare in, who has been a champion of these sessions and an orchestrator of them. I know in the chat she's mentioned creating environments and spaces of mutual respect, peer-to-peer, student, staff, etc. And that leaning goes back and forth in all directions, which is a wonderful kind of summary of some of what we're trying to hold and explain today. But Clare, I wonder if I can bring you in as just part of our kind of closing remarks to maybe pick up on some of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it was actually quite an interesting typo in my comments. I meant that the learning goes back and forth in all directions, but leaning, you know, thinking about trust, maybe that's just as appropriate as well, that it's, you know, thinking of scaffolding and support structures. Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the key things that came out through all of the talks was this thing of the well-being and the sense of community, particularly, I think, online, where, you know, in a way, you could think of like the institution going into people's private spaces. It could be seen as an invasion in a way. It's a very kind of difficult thing to do, isn't it? That sort of, yeah, private spaces becoming kind of very public or shared spaces. Yeah, and the importance of that feeling very safe and respectful and sort of boundaried in a way, or held. And then, yeah, the way that you describe the projects and the attention to kind of really focusing on the minutiae of materials and objects and things around, and yeah, like a kind of mindfulness practice was yeah, really interesting actually. And I guess, yeah, it kind of opens up that possibility for students to have that like toolkit wherever they are. You know, you, like Nigel, you were saying, you can have all the fancy equipment and that's amazing, but to be able to start with like the tiny things that you have around you and just be sort of eyes and ears and all the senses open to what's already there is yeah, it's really powerful.
Brilliant, thanks Clare. I think that's a really good summary, but yeah, also really interesting how we've all interpreted it, well, I guess because our agenda is to enable students with confidence and agency. We want them to be enabled. There's a sense of generosity, but interesting that you kind of think, well, actually we are representing an institution, and how does you know, is there a bit of tension in us creating a bit of trust, or you know, and I can very easily see how that can be manipulated or not handled in a good way. But it's just fascinating, like listening to us and actually hearing the urgency for us to create authentic connection and community and to just the passion we have as makers and practitioners and educators to kind of really instill a passion for making in all of our contexts. And I guess that's the beauty of the 3D Lab guest sessions, is that we just fascinated about making. We don't necessarily mind the context of where it is, because if we think about the approaches to making and the approaches to making literacies, like we've mentioned, we can then go into different contexts and different disciplines and have the way of approaches or be enabled in those spaces because we've been built with that toolkit. You know, I think we need to continue to articulate what is that toolkit, because we all know what they are intrinsically in a kind of embodied sense, you know, but actually we need to continue to take times like these that you've very generously given us, Claire, to think about our practice and to really try and articulate what is those toolkit, you know, what is those tools, because they're not the tools that we thought they were, like pre-pandemic. So actually, how do we cement and like Jack mentioned, you know, how do we work on this blueprint, you know, or articulate the blueprint? And I think a little bit of last week's session was this idea of how do we be masters whilst still learning, and how do we kind of make sense of the landscapes around us whilst still being quite on foreign territory and trying to gain land whilst not really knowing where we're at. And it's just that process of making sense. So I just want to say thank you to Joe and Nigel and Jack and Claire, as always, for being a champion and just, yeah, really gifting us with this time.